Before we started recording, you were talking about the concepts of some of these amazing meditators you've come across and the brain maps and brain waves. And we actually recently had James Hart on the show
Oh
talking
yeah.
about brain waves and some of his work he does with Cybernaut Institute. But I'd love for you to sort of share what you're learning, because it sounds like this is something that still you're actively thinking about right now. So I'd love for you just to peer inside how you're thinking about this.
Well, I'll tell you that I'll answer in kind of a roundabout way in that when I was 15 years old, I went to live on a spiritual community. And so we grew organic vegetables and we meditated and we learned the what's called the perennial philosophy behind every religion. We steeped ourselves in this. I took classes that were sometimes a month long, sometimes 3 months long, really immersing myself in all of this knowledge. But Derek, I couldn't relate to it on a body or feeling level. And like I look at the images of Ramakrishna, the great Indian saint, or Ramana Maharshi, and these were photographs from the late 1800s, or I look at the portrait of St. Francis of Assisi, blissed out, I mean, just totally, completely blissed out in one of his trances, or St. Teresa of Avila, or I'd read the work of Rumi or Hafiz, or one of the other great saints, and they were describing states of not just feeling a little bit happier, they were describing states of utter ecstasy. And I was so miserable as a teenager. I was so depressed. I was so anxious. I was suicidal most of the time. And that didn't change. I mean, I went through suicidal periods in my 20s, my 30s. And I really was so depressed, anxious, miserable, the after effects of PTSD in my childhood. I couldn't relate to those stories. But when I made the commitment to meditate daily, which I did when I was 45, that was 20 years ago, I found that very rapidly meditation began to shift my life. I then learned energy psychology, energy therapies. Those produced rapid resolution of all kinds of problems I'd had for a long time. I was suddenly happier, and with practice became super happy. And then you start to inhabit these states that the Rumis and the Hafizes do. You're just creating poetry in your mind. You're lost in the universe. You're hearing heavenly music. You're in these elevated emotional states. You're so happy, in fact, that when I have people do my meditations now, we have to spend the last few minutes just bringing them back down to earth, because they get so far out there into the cosmos that they can't really function without that. So I've been really looking now at these states and how we can induce them in people. And the cool thing about today is we now can park a St. Teresa of Avila or St. Francis or a Ramana Maharshi inside an MRI, because there are these Tibetan monks that have spent 10,000 hours in meditation and have these evolved minds and brains. We have these Franciscan nuns who've spent 25,000 hours in mystical adoration of Mother Mary or the divine. And so we can put them now in an MRI, we can hook them up to an EEG, and now we can take Rumi and Hafiz and St. Francis and St. Teresa, and we can read their brain waves and we can map exactly which brain regions are active and which aren't. So it turns out that the average person has a lot of activity in what's called by neuroscientists the default mode network. And it's called the default mode network because that's the brain region set to which our brains default when we aren't actively doing a task. So when you aren't doing stuff, when you aren't like working on a spreadsheet, when you aren't writing a blog, when you aren't cooking a meal, when you aren't doing anything, your brain just drifts into this default mode network, and that is really unhappy. And that default mode network is highly focused on the bad stuff from the past and how bad stuff might happen in the future. And that the brain defaults to this because evolution just trained us to be very concerned about the tiger that almost ate us yesterday, the tiger that might spring tomorrow. So the brain defaults to ruminating on the bad stuff. And that's just, it's been called the brain's negativity bias by psychologists for almost a century. But now we can see that this happens to people and we can read which brain regions are active. So those brain regions are highly active in the average person. And one giant study by Harvard shows that we spend about 47% of our lives in a state of negative thinking with the default mode network active. And
Wow.
so what these Tibetans do, what these Franciscan nuns do, is they close their eyes to meditate and they shut down the default network in seconds. I mean, under a second for the highest adepts, under 5 minutes in some of the other advanced yogis, and other parts of their brain to do with happiness light up. And there's a part of the brain, very important part of the brain called the insula, sits right below the neocortex, and it connects the inside of our brain with the outside of our brain. And the insula is to do with pro-social activity. So it's feeling compassion, it's feeling love, it's feeling connection with other human beings, other animals, other species, the whole of life. And that part of the brain, the happy, compassionate, loving part of the brain in these adepts lights up. And so now we can read this brain function in these adepts. So what science is now letting us do is it's letting us actually peek into the brains of these people, and then we're now mapping how to train ordinary people to get there really, really fast, without the monastery, without 10,000 hours, without removing yourself from the world, without going on three-year retreats, which the Buddhists do. And so now we're training people to sit there in their office and just move into that state and then start their workday. So that's kind of the difference between 1,000 years ago and these great figures that I couldn't relate to when I was 15 years old. And now we can train people to do it very quickly because science has given us the background to read their brain states and then let people know how to move into those states at will.